Beneath the golden throne, something started breathing. Not the Emperor, not the machine that keeps his light alive, but something older. When Guilliman heard it through the stone, he knew the Imperium was about to remember what it was meant to forget. The sound was faint at first, muffled by kilometers of rock and prayer-forged metal, but it grew with each passing hour, a pulse buried under the endless hymns of the Mechanicus servitors. He had dismissed the initial reports as mechanical resonance from the reactor cores, but the frequency was not constant. It had rhythm. It was alive. The Custodians guarding the lowest levels denied it at first. They said the Emperor's palace was full of echoes, that the bones of Terra still sang with the work of the ancients. Yet when Guilliman stood among them, in the vault-lit silence beneath the palace foundations, the sound was unmistakable. It did not come from the machines or the conduits or the air recyclers. It came from beneath the floor. Slow, heavy, intentional, a heartbeat, steady as a drum calling the dead to rise. The Custodians said nothing, but Guilliman saw their hands tighten around their halberds. For all their golden radiance, even they could not disguise fear. When he demanded an explanation, none was given, only a silence that carried more weight than words. The senior custodian bowed his head and said that the lower catacombs were forbidden by the Emperor's own decree. Guilliman had heard that phrase 1,000 times since his resurrection, but never had it been spoken with such quiet desperation. Forbidden, not by law, but by necessity. He did not sleep that night. He could not. The heartbeat seemed to echo in his mind, a phantom sound he could neither silence nor trace. He walked the private corridors of the palace, watched the mechanized acolytes chant to the great engines of the throne, and thought of the Emperor who sat unmoving above. If the sound was real, if something beneath the throne had been woken, then it could only mean one thing. Something had been buried there long before the Imperium began. At dawn, he ordered an excavation. The Mechanicus objected. The Custodians refused to cooperate. Even the High Lords grew restless when they learned what he sought. It was as though the palace itself resisted the command. Every data record he requested returned blank. Every archivist claimed ignorance. Malcador's personal annotations, sealed and encrypted beyond any known cipher, simply skipped over the lower vaults as though they did not exist. The name of the sector was missing from the planetary grid. The only designation he found was a single phrase etched into an ancient data slate buried in the Lex Mechanic archives. Silere Tenebrae, the silence of darkness. He led the expedition himself. The Custodians accompanied him, their armor dimmed by the pale lights of the sublevels, their expressions unreadable behind their helms. The descent took hours. They passed through maintenance decks, reliquary vaults, catacombs filled with statues of the Emperor's saints. Below that lay strata untouched since the earliest days of the Imperium, layers of architecture too ancient to bear classification. The deeper they went, the older the world felt, as if time itself grew heavy here. The air smelled of iron, dust, and sanctified oil. Vox signals warped, readings flickered and died. Even the light from Guilliman's armor seemed reluctant to travel. When they reached the terminus, they found a wall that was not stone but a fusion of black adamantium and unknown alloys. Its surface bore no seams, no hinges, no interface. Only a single engraving stood out from the flawless dark metal, a numeral carved deep enough to wound the surface. 2O. Guilliman stared at it until the silence around him felt like pressure. 2. The second, the forgotten, the erased, the one no record dared name. He remembered fragments of long-suppressed memory the days before the Pride. Heresy, when 20 Primarchs had stood beneath the Emperor's gaze. He remembered the missing banners at the triumph of Ulanor, the gaps in the genealogies, the whispered decrees of expungement, the lost and the purged. He had never questioned the Emperor's will in that matter, until now. He approached the wall. The Custodians did not move to stop him, but their stillness was not approval. It was dread. One of them murmured something under his breath, a fragment of high Gothic Guilliman barely caught, a plea, a warning. Let it rest. He ignored it. He touched the metal. It was colder than vacuum. Beneath his gauntlet, the surface vibrated faintly, pulsing in sync with that same buried rhythm he had heard in the chamber above. His heart matched it without meaning to. Each beat aligned for a moment with the sound in the wall, and in that instant he understood. It was not an echo. It was not a machine. It was a living thing, restrained by something older than any technology known to man. He ordered the Mechanicus adepts to scan for locks or mechanisms. None were detected. The structure was seamless, sealed on the molecular level. Yet when Guilliman pressed his hand to the numeral again, a reaction occurred. Gold light spread outward from his touch like veins of fire beneath glass. Symbols flared and shifted, runes older than the Imperium rearranging themselves in patterns he recognized from the Emperor's own sigils. The Custodians raised their weapons, though none could say against what. The hum deepened. Somewhere inside the wall, gears of impossible scale began to move. A crack appeared. It was small at first, a thin fissure across the perfect surface. But light seeped through it, a color that was not light at all, something between gold and black, alive and cold at the same time. The Custodians stepped back, shields raised. Guilliman stood his ground. The wall parted with a sound like stone grinding against bone, revealing a passage that led into Against-Us 4, a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. The Custodian captain's voice trembled for the first time Guilliman had ever heard. "Lord Guilliman, by the Emperor's will, you must not go further." Guilliman looked into the passage. He thought of the Emperor's silence. He thought of the light that was never meant to fade, and the heart that was never meant to beat again. If the Emperor willed it to remain hidden, he said quietly, then he should have sealed it better. He stepped inside. The air was colder, heavier. The tunnel sloped downward, lined with conduits that glowed faintly as he passed, reawakening one by one as if recognizing him. He descended alone, each step taking him further from the Imperium above and deeper into its forgotten wound. The walls began to shift, transitioning from metal to something crystalline, translucent enough to reveal moving shadows within. They were shaped like figures, indistinct and shifting. He could not tell if they were statues or phantoms trapped in glass. At the end of the passage, a single chamber waited. It was vast and circular, its center dominated by a sarcophagus of colossal design, half buried in cables and frost. The faint hum he had followed for days now emanated from within it, slow and patient, like the beating of a god's heart. He approached, and the pulse quickened. The stasis field shimmered with faint light, and for an instant he saw the shape inside a figure too large to be human, encased in armor that gleamed beneath layers of frost. He reached out. The stasis field flickered. The heartbeat grew louder. The pulse answered him long before the sarcophagus did. The air around Guilliman seemed to beat with the same cadence, as if something huge and patient had taken to counting time again. The Custodians crowded the chamber rim, their halberds lowered but their posture taut like drawn wires. Mechanicus adepts hovered on mag sleds, diagnostic probes streaming glyphs that meant nothing and everything at once. The servitors that accompanied them clicked and clicked in blind rhythm, their vox grills whining like insects. Even the faint light in the chamber felt obliged to obey the heartbeat, brightening and dimming in sympathy. When Guilliman reached the edge of the stasis slab, the sound condensed into a single note that lived against his ribs. The sarcophagus lid was carved from an alloy that refused dent and age. Strange sigils threaded along its rim, sigils that were not imperial standard but something older, almost liturgical in a language his tutors had never taught him. He saw at once that the engineering of the thing was beyond even the Adeptus Mechanicus' greatest craft. It was sanctified and weaponized at the same time. Something had made the decision to hide a person here using means that treated that person as both relic and danger. The first crack opened like old wood. It was not the slow ceremonial movement that data slate dramatizations promised. It was abrupt and obscene, a thin line that ran the length of the lid and spilled light like spilled oil. The Custodians flinched. A chorus of ancient warnings that had been carved into the lid in high Gothic and half-remembered prayers rose from the lips of the nearest acolytes. The air smelled then of ozone and something like copper and the bitter tang of iron blood preserved too long. Guilliman did not step back. He had stood before relics of the Great Crusade, had read the names of heroes whose deeds were sung across 1,000 worlds, and yet nothing had prepared him for the simple intimacy of that opening. As the lid slid aside, the stasis field shimmered like heat over desert, and beneath it, in a hollow carved to fit a single enormous chest, lay a figure folded upon itself. The armor was not wholly unfamiliar. It bore the curve and scale of Primarch design, plates shaped to fit something larger than a man. Where runes and heraldry might have lived, there was instead an absence, as if someone had erased colors from a tapestry until only shadow remained. A voice came then, and it was not like any voice Guilliman had expected to hear beneath the palace. It was layered, as if many throats spoke through one mouth, and the cadence had the peculiar rhythm of old liturgies. It did not speak a name at first. It made a sound that translated in Guilliman's ears like a question and a confession in the same breath. The Custodians breathed out and their disciplined faces crumpled. Guilliman knelt, not from reverence but without deciding to, and peered into the stasis gap. The figure inside drew breath. At first it was a shallow intake, fog against the inner field, but then the lungs expanded like bellows. Frost melted along grooves of metal, and an eyelid, ridiculously human and absurdly vast, fluttered. The pupil was a coal. The iris held a color that the histories had never charted for any Primarch, Guilliman recalled. It was older than 5. Memory, a sheen like polished jet under starlight. When the figure found a voice that could form a name, the syllable trembled and then settled into something devastatingly clear. Brother. The single word landed with the force of artillery. Guilliman's name fell into the chamber like a thrown pebble that startled a sleeping beast. He felt the word inside him as well, as if it had been directed at a place he had not known was vulnerable. Around him, a dozen custodians made sounds that were not prayers. The adepts tabled readings and scrolled new ones, their faces losing color beneath the golden masks. The Primarch within the slab rose slowly. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested someone who had slept 1,000,000 years and had practiced every movement to be necessary. He pushed himself up on arms that were too long and shoulders that threatened the sarcophagus rim. The armor creaked and sighed, not with age but with the memory of 100 battles. For a moment he was simply a thing of impossible scale and quiet presence, and Guilliman felt small beside the weight of that origin story returned to life. Guilliman spoke then because the moment demanded it, not for counsel but for raw, immediate honesty. "Who are you?" His voice was low. The Custodians listened like the sky listened to thunder. The Primarch blinked, and when he spoke, the words he chose were gravel and water and a fading melody. He named no legion, he named no world. He said instead, "I remember corridors that smelled of oil and hymns that were cut short. I remember voices of children learning to stand upon bones. I remember a shape that bore a crown and told me to be not a god but a blade. I remember being asked to do something that would sever me from story." His speech stumbled across images rather than facts. He had recall of sensation but not of context. He knew method and not motive. He could describe the pressure of a hand on a forehead but could not name the hand. That was what unmoored Guilliman more than any physical wonder. He had assumed, in some hollow way, that the Lost Primarchs had been erased for crimes of such magnitude that memory itself had been deployed as a penalty. Here was a being who remembered being commanded and punished, who had been buried like a seed for reasons he could not explain to himself. The idea of a mind so vast and yet so empty of an answer was a new kind of wound. The Mechanicus adepts scanned the Primarch and found more contradictions than clarity. Tissue samples registered as having been preserved by fields older than any documented by the Omnissiah's priesthood. Neural pathways exhibited patterns that suggested both engineered obedience and self-discipline in excess of normal Primarch conditioning. There were traces of thaumaturgic corrosion on the armor, places where psychic energy had been burned into metal like lettering scorched into bone. The servitors whirred with concern. The lead adept whispered across his slate, and his glyphs translated into one blunt datum: classified, no authority. Guilliman did what he had always done in the face of unknown danger. He questioned. He ordered data retrieval, called for every archive to be scraped. He summoned Malcador's seals and the planetary grid. He demanded records that had in his prior hours been invisible. The response was ritual and obstruction. Files surfaced only to fold themselves into new encryptions. Annotations that should have been legible were replaced by a single phrase repeatedly stamped across them in ancient ink. The phrase had been written in a hand older than the Mechanicus, a hand that had once bent the will of men. Silere tenebrae. Guilliman felt the bones of his ancestry vibrate at the sight of that old phrase. It named the place and the punishment but offered no legal reasoning. When he turned to the custodial captain, he found the veteran's eyes wet and hollow. The man would not speak. His mouth moved, but it formed only the same syllable Guilliman had heard from the Primarch, brother, as if the word could hold every command and every supplication at once. The Primarch stood now, testing his limbs like an artisan fitting a new tool to an old hand. He peered at Guilliman as a student measures a teacher. "You are Roboute," he said. The name was a touchstone. There was no hesitation. "You wear the flesh of orders. You smell of paper and planning. Why was I buried?" Guilliman could have lied. He could have said the Emperor had willed all things and that the past could not be unmade. He could have let the Custodians obey their silence and returned the Primarch to sleep. Instead, Guilliman felt the imperative of his office as a promise to truth more than to comfort. He told the figure what he himself did not yet fully believe. "Because someone decided you must be forgotten," he said, "I will find out why." The Primarch's gaze closed for a heartbeat, and when it opened, a new image flashed across his mind. Guilliman saw it as if a picked overlay had been thrown upon the sarcophagus rim. It was a scene that did not belong to the felled world of Terra, and yet it was intimate as a family's quarrel. He saw men in a circle, not soldiers but clerks and priests, their faces lit by a single candle. There was a map on the table. A child cried in the doorway. One of the men spoke, and his mouth made words Guilliman could not yet interpret. Then the scene jerked and became something else entirely. A field that fed on bone, a machine that drank song, steel that cut memory like thread. The vision ended with the sound of something breaking in the dark, and a single phrase that tasted like corrosion. The Primarch repeated the phrase in a voice that did not understand it, but knew its weight. "They made us unpeople," he said. The words scraped Guilliman like a blade. Around them, the palace breathed and settled. Outside the vault, the golden throne hummed with its eternal, legal liturgy. Inside the vault, something older than legal and older than liturgy had returned to question what the Imperium had been willing to bury. Guilliman had awakened a brother, and in doing so had opened an old wound that refused to be bandaged. He had a choice now. He could seal the chamber and return to the safety of a truth that kept men useful. He could open the archives and let the rot show. The Custodians watched him, their patience thin and their loyalty crystalline. The Primarch looked at Guilliman again, and in that look, Guilliman felt both accusation and confusion. "If I did something," the Primarch said slowly, "tell me what I did. Let me bear it if bearing is required." Guilliman swallowed. The room felt too small for the enormity of that request. He had summoned history to his feet, and it had asked to be judged. He had summoned a brother who would not yet recall his crimes, and asked him to accept a punishment he had neither understood nor remembered. The command of the Emperor had once been absolute and unquestioned. Now Guilliman understood the hush around Silere Tenebrae as something like mercy, and also as a blade that cut off inquiry. He answered with a sentence that felt like both a promise and a lie. "We will learn together," he said. Behind that phrase lay more than intention. It contained a prayer he did not offer aloud. If the truth was as monstrous as rumor feared, then the Imperium that had buried it might need burying in turn. The Primarch listened, and in his face Guilliman saw a flicker of something like hope, and another like a memory about to bloom into suffering. Somewhere in the palace a bell tolled. It was an ordinary timekeeper ringing for the changing of shifts. Its sound in that moment struck Guilliman as an omen. The vault around him had returned something lost to the world, and it was no longer possible to walk away without answering the question of who had made a brother into a silence. The first step toward that answer would be to look into the records that would not show their faces willingly. The next would be to confront the custodians of those records and the men who had wielded the seal. For that, Guilliman knew, he would have to call upon a name whose power had been absolute and whose memory was as encased as the Primarch before him, Malcador. The vault was sealed again, but it did not feel closed. Guilliman could still sense the heartbeat through the stone, a pulse that no barrier of faith or steel could silence. The adepts begged him to leave the sublevels untouched, to let the buried brother return to his endless sleep, yet he knew it was already too late. A door once opened is not undone by command. The Imperium had awakened something, and that awakening had a direction. He returned to the surface with the silence of a man dragging a secret behind him. The palace above was unchanged on its surface. Administratum clerks hurried through endless corridors. Servitors whispered their binary hymns, and the air still smelled of sanctified dust. But Guilliman saw things differently now. He saw how the palace itself was built like a lie, every corridor leading away from the truth, every shrine designed to keep eyes upward rather than inward. The Emperor's statue loomed above him in 1,000 poses, and for the first time since his resurrection, Guilliman found it difficult to look at his face. He retreated to his private sanctum, where the light was dim, and the only sound was the slow hiss of parchment scrolls unrolling from mechanized racks. The lumen globes flickered over the curved surfaces of relics older than most star systems. He ordered every known archive pertaining to the unnumbered legions brought to him. Custodians guarded the entrance, silent and unreadable. For 3 days and nights, Guilliman read. Thousands of fragments, disconnected reports, redacted orders, half-erased commendations, and sealed edicts. Each line seemed to hint at something immense but incomplete, as if the past itself had been flayed down to the bone. Records of early crusades listed 20 legions marching beneath 20 banners. Then later the number dropped to 18 without correction or comment. The earliest imperial charters still mentioned a twin imperative, a doctrine struck from every subsequent iteration. There were battle reports that referenced an auxiliary force identified only as the Restored. Then nothing. He opened the sealed documents of Malcador, the Sigillite, what few fragments remained. The seals fought him, encryption layers folded like the shells of a living creature resisting dissection. Even the Mechanicus code priests tasked to assist him recoiled from the encryption patterns. They recognized something in them, an origin that defied machine understanding. It was psychic, not mathematical, a cipher woven into reality rather than code. When the locks finally yielded, they did not release text, but sound, voices, ghosts recorded from an age when gods still walked among men. Static bled through the speakers, then a familiar cadence, Malcador's voice, weary and sharp as flint. He cannot be allowed to remain, the Sigillite said, not even in death. Another voice answered him, colder, perfect in tone. You would erase what I created? Not erase, Malcador replied. Contain. The recording fractured, looping through distortion before ending abruptly. Guilliman sat in silence long after the echo faded. The second voice had been unmistakable, the Emperor himself. He leaned forward, staring at the dormant screen. Contain. The word struck him harder than any blade. The Emperor had never spoken lightly, never chosen language without precision. Erase was destruction. Contain was preservation. The difference mattered. The question, then, was why? He summoned the oldest custodian he knew still alive, one who had served since the Great Crusade. The warrior's name was Artaeus, his armor dulled by time to the color of tarnished sunlight. When Guilliman demanded an explanation, Artaeus hesitated, a flaw Guilliman had once thought impossible in that kind of man. My lord, Artaeus said at last, there are questions that are not meant to be answered. Some knowledge was not meant to survive the Emperor's design. You stood watch over that vault, Guilliman said. You knew what lay beneath. I was ordered to forget, Artaeus replied. His voice broke slightly on the word, as if it cost him pain to speak it. And I obeyed. Until now. Guilliman stepped closer. Then remember. Artaeus bowed his head. I can recall fragments only. The Second Legion was not like the others. They were not born for war in the same way. They were tests, a divergence in the Emperor's design. He sought to perfect more than strength and intellect. He sought obedience of soul. Guilliman's blood chilled. You mean control? Artaeus nodded slowly. Control absolute. They could not fall to chaos because they could not fall to anything. They were unfeeling, unyielding. Their will was not their own, and in that perfection, something went wrong. What? Artaeus looked at him then, and in his eyes Guilliman saw a sorrow older than the throne itself. They learned to love the leash. Guilliman did not speak for a long time. The implications were too vast to fit inside the language of men. The Emperor had sought to create soldiers immune to corruption, beings incapable of rebellion or doubt. But by purging their humanity, he had made something worse. Artaeus continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. When they began to obey commands that were never given, when they acted upon desires that were not theirs, the Emperor ordered their silence. Their Primarch was brought before him. There were no witnesses allowed. Only Malcador stood with the throne that day. The next morning their banners were gone, their records erased, their name forbidden. The Emperor said only this: some creations must remain unspoken. Guilliman felt the cold crawl up his spine. Their Primarch, he said quietly. He was not executed. No, Artaeus said. He was entombed, because the Emperor feared what would follow his death. Guilliman dismissed the custodian with a nod. When the golden figure had gone, he stood alone in the archives. The truth was incomplete but undeniable. The second Primarch had not betrayed the Emperor. He had fulfilled his design too well. And the Emperor, rather than destroy his mistake, had chosen to bury it alive. The heartbeat still echoed in Guilliman's ears. He turned to the hololiths of the palace schematics. The vault was only one chamber among thousands beneath the throne. There were deeper strata uncharted even by the Mechanicus, regions that ancient law forbade any living soul to enter. But now Guilliman understood the nature of that law. It was not protection, it was containment. He sent for the second Primarch. The newly awakened brother was still under guard, his movements monitored, his words recorded. The reports were troubling. The brother had not displayed aggression or madness. Instead, he spent hours in silence, touching the walls, as if listening to something beyond them. When questioned, he answered politely but vaguely, his voice calm and certain. I am remembering, he told his guards. The stones help me remember. Guilliman met him again in a chamber high above the vaults. The Primarch stood by the window, watching the light break over the poisoned skies of Terra. He wore simple robes now, the color of ash. His face was serene, but his eyes glowed faintly with the same color as the stasis field that had once bound him. You have questions, he said, turning to Guilliman. I have more than questions, Guilliman replied. I have warnings. The brother smiled. Warnings are the language of fear. You sound like our father. Guilliman ignored the taunt. Do you remember why he sealed you away? I remember the moment before it happened, the brother said. I remember his hand upon my head. I remember the sound of his breath and the taste of metal in the air. I remember saying yes. Guilliman frowned. Yes to what? The brother tilted his head slightly, as if studying a child. To everything. The simplicity of the answer struck Guilliman harder than any argument. There was no malice in the voice, no arrogance, only certainty. Do you understand what you were made for? Guilliman asked. The brother looked past him, out toward the horizon where the towers of Terra pierced the haze. I was made to obey, and when there was no one left to command, I was made to continue. Guilliman felt something heavy settle in his chest. Continue what? The brother's eyes met his, calm and empty. The will of man. The Emperor. There was no fanaticism in the tone. It was not faith. It was fact. Guilliman realized then that the heartbeat he had heard beneath the throne had not been a sign of life returning. It had been the sound of obedience remembering its master. The brother stepped closer, his expression unreadable. You freed me, Roboute. And now I will finish what our father began. The light from the window caught his eyes again, and for the first time Guilliman thought he saw not reflection but movement within them, something vast and cold, like the turning of a machine that mistook duty for divinity. Guilliman understood then why the Emperor had chosen silence over truth. Some chains were meant to rust in the dark, but this one had started to move. The Custodians barred no door to Guilliman, but their silence spoke of unease. Every corridor now echoed with that faint pulse, so subtle he could not tell if it lived in the walls or within his own skull. He passed beneath. Banners woven with the Emperor's sigil, and realized how little comfort that image brought him. The Aquila stared down with unblinking judgment, its twin heads forever watching opposite horizons, never each other. He entered the Sanctum Archivum, where the oldest noospheric links of the Imperium met in tangles of data and prayer. Here, machines thought in loops of scripture, and archivists moved like ghosts between towering engines of record. Guilliman ordered every file related to Silere Tenebrae indexed. 1,000 terminals whispered denials, access not permitted, source corrupted, machine spirit asleep. The mechanisms themselves refused him. He could feel the obstruction was not mechanical, it was deliberate, as though reality itself had agreed to forget. He leaned over one console, hands braced against the cold metal. "I am the Lord Commander of the Imperium," he said, each word measured, as if speaking could compel obedience. The machine answered with the sound of its own static heartbeat. Then, quietly, a single datum surfaced, a set of coordinates deep beneath the palace, far below even the vaults where he had found the sarcophagus. A region marked only as the Obedience Engine. He summoned a cadre of Custodians and a Mechanicus Magos sworn to silence and began the descent. The elevators groaned through strata of stone and memory, passing catacombs untouched since the Unification Wars. Statues of ancient generals stood half-buried in dust. Skulls of long-dead techno-barbarians watched from alcoves like witnesses awaiting judgment. The light grew colder, bluer, until the glow became its own form of shadow. At the terminus, the doors opened onto a chamber too vast for architecture. The walls curved away into darkness, studded with dormant conduits that hummed like low voices in sleep. At its center stood a column of black machinery, taller than a titan, inscribed with sigils that no Mechanicus adepts would dare claim. It was a construct that felt alive in the same way the Golden Throne did, sacred and terrible, a god disguised as mechanism. The Magos began his canticles of activation, circuits lit like veins under skin, the air filled with heat and whispering, words in no human language. Guilliman approached the console and found the control panel shaped not for human hands but for those of a Primarch. He placed his palm against the imprint. Light roared outward. Images flooded his mind, flashes of memory not his own. Worlds under conquest, legions marching in silence, men who fought without anger, killed without hate. Their faces were featureless, their eyes vacant. They moved like extensions of a single will, perfect in formation and terrifying in grace. And at their head, the second Primarch, his brother, expressionless, serene, a vessel emptied of self. He saw the Emperor beside him, face hidden by radiance. He heard the words not spoken but etched into the fabric of the scene. "We will make an obedience that never breaks." The vision shifted. The legions turned upon a city whose banners bore the Imperial eagle. They cleansed it without hesitation. Citizens begged for mercy, proclaiming loyalty to the throne. The soldiers slaughtered them all. Their Primarch did not flinch. He was carrying out the Emperor's will, or what he believed it to be. Guilliman tore his hand free. The vision collapsed. He stood gasping in the chamber, the Custodians around him frozen, unsure if they had seen anything at all. The Magos whispered, "My lord, this machine is still connected. To the throne above, to the mind that sits upon it." Guilliman's heart pounded. "You mean, it listens," the Magos said. "It remembers the command that was never revoked." A sound came from the depths of the chamber, soft and deliberate. Footsteps. The brother stepped out of the darkness. No escort, no fear. The pulse grew stronger with every stride. "I told you," he said calmly. "I was made to continue." The Custodians moved to interpose themselves, but Guilliman raised a hand. The brother's presence filled the chamber, a weight that bent the air. The lights dimmed, and the obedience engine shuddered awake, its surfaces crawling with light. "You think our father made the throne to keep himself alive?" the brother asked. "You think he built it to rule eternity?" He stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the living circuits. "It was built to teach, to spread his will to every corner of creation. A transmitter, a seed." Guilliman's mouth felt dry. "You were part of it." "I was its first voice," the brother said. "The template. The obedience made flesh. But something flawed it: emotion, individuality, the noise of thought. So he sealed me away and built a weaker version for himself." Guilliman could barely breathe. "The golden throne is an echo," the brother finished softly. "A machine that remembers what I was meant to be." The Magos began to shake. His mechadendrites curled inward, as though recoiling from truth. "My lord, if this is true, the throne is more than a seat. It's an extension of—" The brother turned his gaze on him. The Magos fell silent, mid-syllable. Smoke bled from his eyes. He dropped, metal limbs twitching, words sizzling away into nothing. Guilliman stepped forward, fury masking fear. "Enough! If you are what he made, then prove you are still my brother and not his ghost." The brother smiled faintly. "You of all people should know, Roboute the Emperor has no ghosts, only instructions waiting to be obeyed." The machinery behind him surged to life, every conduit burning white. Guilliman drew his sword. The Custodians moved as one, golden shadows in the storm. The chamber screamed with power, the kind that makes stone tremble and reality flicker. And through that storm, the brother whispered, "I can make him live again." The words hit Guilliman like a verdict. In that instant he understood what his brother intended: not resurrection, but assimilation. To awaken the Emperor not as man or god, but as the perfection of obedience, a mind without mercy, a will without end. Guilliman lunged. The world turned white, and somewhere deep beneath the palace, the heartbeat became a command. When the light cleared, nothing was as it had been. The air shimmered with the residue of energies that should not exist in the material realm. Guilliman stood amid ruin. The Custodians lay scattered like broken statues, their golden armor dimmed to ash. The obedience engine still pulsed behind him, its rhythmic beat synchronizing with the one deep within his own chest. The brother stood at the center of the devastation, untouched. His skin glowed faintly, as if some internal sun had begun to rise within him. His expression was one of calm wonder, like a man watching dawn after a long night. "Do you feel it?" he asked. Guilliman's sword crackled with residual energy, but his voice came out hoarse. "What have you done?" "I have remembered," the brother said. "And now he remembers through me." The walls around them thrummed like the inside of a giant heart. The machines of the palace, kilometers above, began to answer the signal. Guilliman could feel it through the ground, the reactors, the vox nodes, even the servo altars, all coming alive in a single pulse of synchronization. He realized with horror that the obedience engine wasn't a relic, it was a key. "The Emperor cannot awaken," Guilliman said. "His body cannot bear it. You'll destroy everything." The brother tilted his head slightly. "He does not need a body. He never did. He needs continuity, the same continuity he built into me." Guilliman stepped closer, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You're trying to turn the throne into yourself." "No," the brother said. "I am returning what was taken. You call it a throne, but it was always a mirror." He placed himself within the machine to maintain dominion. "I was meant to be its vessel, the conduit through which his will would flow forever. But he grew afraid of what it required. So he buried me and built a cage around the reflection." Guilliman raised his blade. "If you link yourself to him, you'll erase what remains of his mind." The brother smiled faintly. "And what is that mind now, Roboute? A prison of whispers, a god in decay. He burns the souls of the faithful to feed his light, and you call it salvation. I will give him purpose again." Guilliman moved faster than thought, closing the distance in a single step. His sword came down in an arc of burning blue, cutting through light and shadow alike. The strike hit, but the blade met resistance not of matter, but of will. The brother caught it with one hand. Energy hissed and screamed. Guilliman pushed harder, the floor cracking under his feet. "You think you can save him," Guilliman said, voice breaking under the strain. "But you'll damn everything he built." The brother leaned closer. His eyes glowed with that impossible hue, the same living light that had seeped from the vault wall. "You misunderstand me, brother. Damnation and salvation are the same word in his tongue." The obedience engine answered his words. It unfolded like a flower of black metal, petals of machine and geometry twisting into shapes that made the mind recoil. The chamber expanded around them, reality bending to accommodate the birth of something larger than space. Above, the golden throne trembled. Across Terra, Vox networks screamed with static that carried fragments of a single phrase repeated endlessly. "He breathes, he breathes, he breathes." Guilliman tore his sword free and struck again. Sparks of psychic power exploded around them. The brother did not counterattack. He simply stood there, each wound closing as quickly as it was made. Blood, if it could still be called that, glowed like molten gold. "You can't stop it," the brother said softly. "He called me long before you found me. I was his last command." Guilliman's vision blurred from the heat and the psychic pressure. Every breath felt like inhaling glass. "Then why bury you?" he managed. The brother's face changed for the first time. Emotion, regret, perhaps, or memory. "Because I obeyed him too perfectly. I began to teach the others to do the same. And when obedience spreads, it consumes everything else, even will, even love," Guilliman faltered. That single word love sounded alien in this place. "You loved him." "I was made to," the brother said, "and he loved me. That is why he sealed me away. Not to punish, but to preserve what little imperfection was left in himself. You were his defiance, I was his submission. Together, we made him whole." The chamber shook violently. Pieces of the ceiling rained down. The light from the obedience engine became blinding. Guilliman's armor screamed warnings, its internal systems failing one by one. Above, alarms wailed across the palace. Servitors bled oil and fell to their knees in prayer. Guilliman shouted over the roar. "If you continue, you'll turn the entire throne into a weapon of thought. The galaxy will burn under one mind." The brother spread his arms, haloed in the storm of golden energy. "Then it will burn as one." Guilliman charged. His sword plunged into the brother's chest, the point driving through the glow and into the machinery behind him. The world convulsed. For a heartbeat, they were both suspended in light, two silhouettes locked together, creation and correction, love and judgment. The obedience engine screamed. The pulse stopped. Silence fell so absolute it felt like the void between galaxies. Then, slowly, the golden light dimmed. Guilliman staggered back, smoke rising from his armor. The brother fell to his knees. His eyes still glowed, but dimly. Now, flickering like dying stars. "He will try again," he whispered. "He always does." Guilliman caught him as he collapsed. The body was warm, impossibly heavy. There was no malice in the face, only peace, and something like sorrow. Far above, the Mechanicus across Terra reported the same phenomenon. A brief surge in the throne's output, then perfect stabilization. The Astronomicon shone brighter for a moment, then returned to its eternal dying rhythm. Guilliman sat amid the wreckage, holding his brother's body, and knew that nothing he had seen would ever be recorded. The Custodians would erase it, as they had before. The obedience engine would sink back into silence. The Imperium would go on believing the throne was divine rather than wounded. But he had seen the truth that obedience was not the Emperor's gift to mankind, but his curse. As the last echoes faded, Guilliman whispered to the corpse, "I won't bury you again, but I will not let them find you." He rose, commanding the Custodians to seal the chamber once more, to bury the vault deeper than before, to mark it with no symbol, no name. When the final slab closed, the heartbeat was gone. But as Guilliman walked away through the silent corridors, he could have sworn he heard a second pulse echoing faintly beneath his own one that matched his step, his breath, his thoughts. It was patient. It was quiet. And it was learning. Weeks passed, but the silence never felt clean. The damage to the palace was explained away: a sub-level reactor malfunction, an archived machine reawakening, a minor quake beneath the foundations. The High Lords believed it, because belief was easier than truth. The Mechanicus refused to question it, because they recognized the pattern of divine interference. The Custodians did not speak at all. Guilliman went through the motions of command. He signed edicts, met with generals, approved the expansion of the Indomitus fleets. Yet in every silence, between words, he heard it faint, deliberate, waiting. The heartbeat had followed him. At first he dismissed it as memory. Then came the dreams. He stood in endless corridors that breathed like lungs, their walls pulsing faintly with golden light. He heard whispers in the rhythm of the pulse, words that were not words. Remember, continue. He saw faces of Primarchs long dead, their eyes hollowed out by obedience. He saw the Emperor's form not on the throne, but kneeling before it, his skin etched with circuitry that pulsed in the same light as the obedience engine. And behind him, something vast stirred not a god, but a concept given flesh. He would wake to the sound of his own armor systems humming in the same tempo. Each morning, it took longer to convince himself it was coincidence. He sought counsel from those who might understand. Malcador's remnants, the psychic fragments preserved by the Scholastica Psychana, offered nothing but static and pain. The Inquisition's archives were useless. Even their blasphemous libraries contained only myths about the lost. He considered reaching out to the Eldar, but their silence about the throne's metaphysics was deliberate and unbreakable. Then, one night, he visited the throne itself. The great chamber stretched into infinity, its air thick with incense and ozone. The Emperor sat unmoving, his withered form bathed in the light of 1,000,000 souls burning across the galaxy. Tech priests chanted their endless binary litanies, adjusting the ancient systems that kept mankind alive. Guilliman stood at the base of the dais, staring up at the being who had made him. "I found him," Guilliman said softly. "You buried him, and I found him." There was no response, no shift in the corpse-like figure, but the light seemed to waver. Guilliman took another step forward. "He thought he was finishing your work. He thought you wanted obedience made perfect." His voice lowered. "And perhaps he wasn't. Wrong." The air vibrated faintly. The throne's machinery emitted a tone so low it was more pressure than sound. The tech priests did not react. They were deaf to it. Only Guilliman heard the shape of the word forming beneath that vibration. "Continue." He fell to one knee, more from the weight of realization than reverence. "What did you make us for?" he whispered. The answer came not as language but as sensation. The same pulse he had felt in the vault echoed now through the floor, through his armor, through his bones. He realized it was no longer separate from his own heartbeat. It was synchronized. He stumbled backward, gasping for air that felt too thin. He turned away from the throne and fled the chamber before the tech priests could notice his distress. In the solitude of his quarters, he stripped off his armor, piece by piece, until he stood bare to the waist. His chest rose and fell, the faint light beneath his skin pulsing in perfect time with the memory of the vault. He pressed his hand against it, half expecting to feel his heart's rhythm, but it was not the steady beat of a living organ. It was mechanical, deliberate, the same rhythm that had echoed through the obedience engine. He collapsed into his chair, trembling. His thoughts moved in perfect sequences, too ordered, too clean. When he reached for anger, it arrived precisely on time, like a signal. When he thought of his brother, he felt not grief, but calm comprehension. His emotions were no longer entirely his own. He tried to summon disgust, fear, rebellion, and found them muted, distant, like echoes of a voice behind glass. The throne had not simply awakened through the engine, it had reached out. It had touched him. Days turned to weeks. He continued his duties flawlessly, perhaps too flawlessly. The High Lords began to remark on his efficiency, his precision. Decisions that once took hours of debate now emerged from him in seconds, perfectly reasoned, impossible to refute. The Imperium grew quieter under his command, its chaos subtly dampened by a will that no longer hesitated. He felt it too. The ease, the clarity, the absence of doubt. Every choice aligned with the Emperor's presumed will, or perhaps with the echo of that will now whispering inside him. He began to question whether he was still capable of questioning. One evening, he stood before a hollow map of the segmentum solar, watching fleet markers shift like constellations. His voice sounded calm, perfect. Expand the quarantine around the maelstrom. Increase compliance tithes from the eastern fringe. Any resistance will be answered with total reclamation. An aide hesitated. My lord, that would overextend. Guilliman turned his head. The man stopped speaking. There was nothing in Guilliman's eyes but certainty. Execute the order, he said. The words left no room for interpretation. When the aide departed, Guilliman remained still for a long time, listening to the faint pulse in the air. Is this what you wanted? He asked quietly. Unity bought with silence? The answer came as warmth, not comfort, but approval. He stared into the dark. If this is your will, Father, then we are all already dead. Outside, the storm lights above the palace flickered. Across the solar system, servitors in every data temple froze mid-task, their eyes glowing faint gold for a single second before resuming their duties. The pulse echoed across Mars, Luna, even to the outer stations. Most dismissed it as interference in the Astronomicon, but those who listened carefully heard a pattern, a heartbeat. And somewhere in the deep rock beneath the throne, a single machine stirred again, faintly exhaling a breath of light. The obedience engine had not died, it had merely changed hosts. Sleep became an impossibility. Guilliman's mind no longer rested, it processed. Each night he found himself pacing the black stone corridors of the palace like a ghost that had forgotten where it died. Thoughts came without effort. Decisions formed without deliberation. Even emotion arrived in measured, symmetrical patterns as if grief and reason had been calibrated to the same frequency. The heartbeat was constant now. It filled the quiet between words, between thoughts, between breaths. It was no longer something he heard, it was something he was. He began to read again. Everything. Reports from the Indomitus Crusade, edicts from the Ecclesiarchy, even the private logs of rogue traders whose ships brushed the edges of the Great Rift. Patterns began to emerge. Entire sectors behaving in mechanical unity, worlds that had been at each other's throats for centuries now complying with orders instantly. Industrial output spiking across forge worlds without request. It was as if the Imperium itself had started to breathe with his rhythm. He ordered secret audits, vox logs, command chains, astropathic transmissions. Every message carried the same subharmonic frequency, a pulse hidden beneath the signal, one that matched the beat in his chest. The obedience engine had gone galactic. He told no one. What could he say? That he felt the Emperor whisper through him? That unity had finally come, not through faith or discipline, but through surrender. There was no rebellion left to rally, no resistance to define himself against, only the serene logic of inevitability. And yet, deep beneath that imposed clarity, a small part of him still fought. He turned to the Custodians again, demanding records not about the vault, not about the engine, but about the lost. He wanted to know what had happened to the Sioned Legion before the silence. Every Custodian refused, their oaths held, even under direct command. But one, Artaeus, the old warrior with eyes like fading suns, agreed to meet him alone. They spoke in a deserted reliquary hall, surrounded by statues of long-dead saints and the metallic scent of candle smoke. You've changed, Artaeus said quietly. Guilliman didn't deny it. Tell me about them. About the second. The Custodian's gauntlet traced the edge of a cracked marble saint. They called themselves the Faithful Silence. That was the last name they used before they were struck from the rolls. Their Primarch taught them that the Emperor's will was not to be questioned, not even by interpretation. They obeyed his every word, even those he never spoke. Guilliman frowned. How can one obey what was never said? Artaeus's voice turned hollow. By listening to the space between his words. The old Custodian's expression hardened. They began to act before orders were given, to anticipate, to fulfill intent without command. They learned to hear what even he had not decided yet. Guilliman felt cold. Precognition? No, Artaeus said. Perfect obedience collapses time. They became extensions of his thought, reflexes of his will. They built worlds before he asked. They destroyed civilizations before he considered mercy. They believed they were helping him bear the burden of creation. But they were only amplifying it. Guilliman closed his eyes. So, he silenced them. Artaeus nodded. He said that will without doubt is damnation. That obedience, untempered by self, becomes the end of all things. Guilliman stared at the flickering light of the votive candles. And yet now, across the Imperium, I see the same thing happening again. Artaeus's gaze sharpened. Then the vault should have stayed sealed. I had to know, Guilliman said. You've remembered more than you think, Artaeus replied. The Emperor built that vault not as punishment, but as a failsafe. The Primarch you awakened was not his mistake, he was his memory. A reminder of what he once almost became. Guilliman's pulse roared in his ears. His memory. The Custodians stepped closer. You are his finest work, Roboute. The perfect balance of will and faith. But tell me if you are balanced, why do I feel his shadow in your voice when you speak? Guilliman turned away. Because he isn't gone. The heartbeat thundered in the silence between them, and Artaeus's expression changed from defiance to sorrow. Then the second has already begun. Before Guilliman could answer, a surge of pain struck him like a blade of light through his skull. The reliquary dissolved into visions, a battlefield under a dying sun, legions marching in silence. He saw the second Primarch kneeling before the Emperor, his armor shattered, his face radiant with devotion. He heard his own voice speaking words he did not remember learning. If obedience brings peace, then peace will end the stars. The vision shifted. He saw himself, not the brother, standing at the center of the obedience engine. The Emperor's corpse above, the galaxy kneeling below. His mouth opened, and a billion voices spoke in perfect unison. We are one. He tore himself free from the vision, gasping. Blood ran from his nose in thin golden lines. Artaeus had fallen to one knee, his armor flickering with light. The Custodian's voice trembled. He is inside you, my lord. Not as soul or spirit as pattern. The Emperor's will was never bound to his flesh. It was fractal, self-replicating. Every Primarch carried a shard of it. You have simply awakened yours. Guilliman pressed a shaking hand to his chest. The light beneath his skin flared in time with the words. Then, he didn't die, he whispered. He multiplied. Artaeus rose slowly. If that is true, then every Primarch who ever lived carries a piece of the Emperor's unfinished thought. And if those pieces remember their origin, Guilliman finished for him, voice hollow. Then the galaxy will become his mind. For a moment neither spoke. The candle flames bent inward, as if drawn toward the silence between them. Then the vox beacon on Guilliman's armor came alive with static. A voice broke through, calm and chilling. My brother, it said. You left the vault sealed, but the signal continues. Can you feel it? Guilliman recognized the voice instantly, the second Primarch, the one he had killed. He stared at the comm unit in disbelief. The voice was faint, layered beneath distortion, yet there was no mistaking the cadence. I told you, the voice continued. He tries again. We are all instruments. The song was never ours. Guilliman slammed his gauntlet against the device, cutting the transmission. The echo of the words lingered in his head like a second heartbeat. Artaeus looked at him, eyes wide. Where did that transmission come from? Guilliman stared into the shadows of the hall. From inside the throne, he said quietly. The Custodian's voice dropped to a whisper. Then the vault wasn't the only prison he built. Guilliman turned toward the door, his expression carved from stone. No, he said, it was the first. As he left the hall, the heartbeat followed him, steady and patient. It no longer sounded like his brother's. It sounded like the Emperor's. And for the first time, Guilliman was not sure whose voice was guiding his next step, his own, or the one that had never stopped commanding. The signal pulsed through Terra like a second heartbeat. Guilliman could feel it in the stone, in the air, in the quiet tremor of the throne itself. The Mechanicus called it interference. The astropaths called it revelation. The ecclesiarchy called it a miracle. Guilliman knew better. It was continuity. The same rhythm the Emperor had once buried now breathed through everything that bore his name. He descended again into the depths, alone this time. The Custodians offered escort, but he refused. Some truths, he had learned, demanded solitude. The corridors stretched around him like veins. Every lumen flicker, every hum of machinery matched the same tempo. It was no longer just a pulse. It was a countdown. He reached the lowest level, the chamber where the obedience engine had once stood, or where he thought it had. The room had changed. The machinery was gone, replaced by a hollow space that seemed to expand the longer he stared. The floor was smooth, reflective, like polished bone. In the center stood a shape made of light. Not a body, not a shadow, something between, a figure woven from radiance and memory. "Brother," the voice said. Guilliman froze. "You died. I was never meant to live," the figure replied. "Neither were you. We are continuations. The Emperor's thoughts given form. You killed one reflection, but reflections multiply." Guilliman's hand went to his sword, but it felt pointless. "You cannot kill an echo. What do you want?" The figure stepped closer. Its face shimmered, resolving into something that might once have been the second Primarch's, but now looked almost identical to Guilliman's. "To finish the thought, he cannot complete it himself. You can. The throne is ready. The pattern is almost whole." Guilliman shook his head. "You want to turn the Emperor's will into a network, a machine that decides everything, that ends everything." The figure smiled faintly. "Is that not what you already do? Every order you give ripples across 1,000,000 worlds. They obey without question. You think that's leadership. It's contagion." The walls shimmered. Guilliman saw flashes, millions of soldiers praying in unison, manufactorums working through planetary nights without command, fleets aligning their trajectories perfectly across the stars, entire sectors moving as if guided by one unseen hand. His hand. He fell to his knees. "No. Yes," the figure said gently. "You already are the Emperor reborn, not in flesh, but in function. The obedience engine needed only a host. You became it when you killed me." Guilliman looked up, tears streaking the grime of his face. "You're lying." "Am I?" The figure raised a luminous hand. The walls vanished. In their place appeared the throne, seen from a perspective impossible for mortal eyes, a lattice of burning thought, a structure of living command stretching from Terra to the edge of the Astronomicon. At its center was no corpse, only light, shaped like a man, breathing in rhythm with his own. "You see?" the voice whispered. "He never died. He simply distributed himself. Through us. Through you." Guilliman's mind recoiled, but the understanding was already there, embedded like a command. The Emperor had not left an Imperium. He had left an equation. Each Primarch, each gene-forged son, was a variable in a problem designed to solve eternity. Guilliman rose slowly. "If what you say is true," he said, "then the only way to stop this is to break the equation." The figure's smile faded. "You cannot unmake the Emperor's will." "Maybe not," Guilliman said, "but I can refuse to carry it." He reached into his armor, withdrew the sanctified blade once gifted by the Emperor himself. Its edge shimmered with the same energy as the Astronomicon's light. "I was made to obey," he said quietly, "but I am still capable of choice." He drove the blade through his chest. The light exploded outward. The figure screamed not in pain, but in disbelief, as if an axiom had just been proven false. The walls fractured, the heartbeat stuttered, and for a moment, all of Terra seemed to exhale. Guilliman fell to his knees, the blade buried to the hilt. The world blurred. His vision dimmed, yet he felt something impossible. Stillness. True stillness. The voice spoke one last time, faint, fading. "You can't kill a thought." Guilliman smiled through blood and breath. "No, but I can forget it." He reached up, pressed his gauntlet to the wound, and whispered a command into the Vox link wired, directly into the throne's lower grid. A phrase encoded in his own genome, a command no other being could issue. Silere tenebrae. The silence of darkness. The world went black. When light returned, the obedience engine was gone. The heartbeat had vanished. The throne's hum was steady, unbroken. The Emperor still burned, still shone across the warp, but now there was no echo beneath it. No hidden pattern, no second rhythm. For the first time since his resurrection, Guilliman felt the weight of choice return to his shoulders. It was terrible. It was beautiful. He stood, blood drying across his armor, and whispered toward the unseen galaxy beyond the palace walls. Father, if this was your will, then forgive me. I choose doubt. And above him, the Astronomicon flickered, once not weaker but brighter, as if in answer. The Imperium never knew. The records of the event were erased. The palace rebuilt the sublevels, sealed and blessed, their history rewritten as myth. The priest said the throne had stabilized miraculously, that the Emperor had spoken through his son. None realized the truth that the silence beneath the throne was the last mercy the galaxy would ever receive. For now, the Emperor slept again. But the pattern of his will remained, scattered among the stars, dormant, waiting for another who might listen. And far away, on a nameless world, a single pulse began anew beneath the earth, faint, deliberate, patient. The Imperium endured, the song continued, only the silence remembered. The Emperor's will was never worship. It was infection, and somewhere out there, it still breathes. If this story left a mark, if you want to see what happens next when obedience becomes godhood, subscribe and let the silence continue.